it matter if the Chilchot inquiry is ever published? In the magazine this week, Peter Hitchens looks at the delays that have gone on with the report and asks, does anyone really care what the report will say? Peter Hitchens, we've heard endlessly from families who suffered from the Iraq War over the past few weeks who have saying the report must be published now. There's a lot of stalling going on. This is a big establishment cover-up. What's going on with the Chilchot inquiry, and why do you think it doesn't really matter if it's ever published?
Well, who can fail to sympathise with the families bereaved by the war? But I have a feeling that if the report ever is published, they'll be as dissatisfied then as they are now, because I don't think it will actually provide any satisfaction, any final resolution. It will, as far as we can discover, distribute the blame so widely that it won't really land on anyone at all. That is, if it blames anybody. And my view increasingly, that I used to care a great deal about it, is that it would probably be better if it were never published and we just told Sir John Chilchot just to go away and forget about his silly report, inform him that he's failed, and start realising that there will never be from the British establishment any full statement of apology or regret for one of its biggest mistakes in our national history.
Because one of the things you say in your piece, this idea of Tony Blair being hauled up to a war crimes tribunal is just a sort of Trotskyite dream, something that's never actually going to happen.
Well, as someone who used to have Trotskyist fantasies, I can recognise one when I see one. I just don't think that that's very likely, and occasionally he will continue to be arrested by waiters while he's having dinner, which is quite funny and we can all enjoy it, and he richly deserves it, but it's not going to end at The Hague because he simply isn't going to get caught into that procedure, and he knows better than to be so, and we should know better than to imagine it's going to happen. Whatever punishment is going to fall on him, and I tend to think that the ghastly, empty life which he now leads is probably in the end more of a punishment than anything any of us could devise. That's all you can ever expect to happen, and he's never going to admit that he did anything wrong. This is a man who told the Pope that he was wrong about just war theory. How on earth is he ever going to be persuaded that he got it wrong over the Iraq War?
But Fraser Nelson, do you think David Cameron should really go and tell Sir John Chilchot after 6 years he should just forget it and go and everyone get on with their lives? That's not going to calm anyone down, is it?
Well, I do think this needs to be a finite process. I mean, the problem here is this so-called Maxwellisation, where he's gone to all people who've been criticised and asked them for their response to get their defence in, and hasn't really set a timetable on this, so it's dragging on. And unless something is done, unless a deadline is set, then it will drag on for a very long time. Now, I do quite want to see it published, and not least because so much public money has been spent in its production. But there are also very important questions which are still left unanswered from this. To me, I'm not as concerned as Peter is about the decision to go to depose Saddam Hussein, which I still think on balance was the right one. I'm concerned about what happened quickly thereafter, specifically Basra, how it came to be that a city in charge of the British military was left to the hands of Shiite death squads, and why it was that hardly any information about these developments came back to Britain. I think what happened after we invaded is the real scandal. It's funny, I'm one of the few people who supported the war in 2003 who's still willing to say that I think that was the right decision then. But I had believed that we would have finished what we started, that we would have put in enough time, effort and resource to try to help Iraq make the transition to democracy. That didn't happen, and to me, that's a question I think that we ought to look at, not why we fought, but why we lost.
There's a very simple answer to why all these things went wrong, which is because of the fantasy which drove us into Iraq in the first place. Fundamentally, the idealist fantasy that we were going in to overthrow a wicked regime and replace it with some vague good regime. Whereas, in fact, we were simply an army of invasion, and armies of invasion are not treated the same way as liberators. We acted as if we were liberators, and we were treated by the people who we thought we'd liberated as occupiers and as invaders, and that is the reason why it all went wrong. Also, the other fantasy is that we're still a great power, when we're not. We're miles from being a great power. We don't have the resources to be a great power. We simply don't have the capacity.
Well, it wasn't us. It was us in America.
Political capacity to be a great power. We simply don't have it. The United States has specifically always refused to be an imperial or colonial power. Had it actually set out to make Iraq into a colony, I think that would have been a failure. because our own experience in Iraq in the 1920s tells you how difficult that would be, but at least it would have been more honest and possibly more likely to succeed. But to go in as they went in on an idealist and ultimately utopian basis was bound to fail and bound to lead to a huge contrast between the declared nature of the mission and the actual nature of the mission, and that's why all these things went wrong.
See, I think Peter's right in saying these questions are not going to be answered by the Chilchot inquiry. Historians are going to be debating many years hence about whether we were right or wrong to go into Iraq or Afghanistan. To me, the purpose of the Chilchot inquiry is to look at the more practical issues. If we need to learn from this mistake, we need to learn from our defeat in Basra. The military needs to learn perhaps it was a mistake to go in at all, given that the size of our military was never up to the task that we thought it was. Now, that's what I think we need to answer, and it still isn't answered. Even now, you can see David Cameron talk about, to quote one of his recent speeches, closing down ungoverned spaces in the Sahara, as if he actually believes he is a military still capable of that task.
Again, this is all part of our national fantasy of what kind of country we are, of what we're capable of doing. We simply are not that kind of country anymore, to the extent that we ever were. Our conquest of much of the world was an amazing stroke of luck in most cases, where we simply didn't come up against much in the way of opposition. We were never, in any significant way, a major military power. We were a naval power, and we never become a military power, and that except during the two world wars, which are an exceptional part.
But we were able to intervene in Sierra Leone, for example.
We were able to, though.
And that's a better place for us having done so.
One would say that that's not over yet. As with all these things, any intervention is only as good as its long-term results, and anyone who's seen that rather wonderful film, Charlie Wilson's War, will always react to claims of success in any international intervention with the words, "we'll see." I don't know whether that's a success or not. It can still be made to look like one, but whether it actually will be one in the long term, I think we have yet to find out. And that's the case with all these things. What is the long-term outcome, and were we justified in doing them? And shouldn't we actually, as a people, as well as a political class and media class, shouldn't we, as a people, begin to recognise that we are not what we think we are, and we are not capable of doing these things, and we should stop doing them altogether? It's just not going to get us anywhere good.
Fraser, to pick up on something you said before, you said you want to see the Chilcot report with a timeline to get it published, but this is what Sir John has pushed against, because it's an independent inquiry, and if you've got the government leaning on him to say you've got to get it out by this year, you've got it out by next year, we've had reports that the whole thing's being rewritten, or they're going back to army generals and what have you. So if you do that, doesn't it just make the whole thing pointless if it's being told to get it done and not complete the job?
It's not pointless. I mean, we can't have it dragging on like the Bloody Sunday inquiry. I mean, these things, there is no limit to how far you can drag on, because the question will never be resolved. It will never be closed, and that's why it's got the capacity to go on into infinity. Which is why I think you need to bring it to a crude halt, to say, okay, Sir John, you've had X many years, X amount of money, it's now time to finish it. This is, of course, what journalists do. The Spectator would never be published if we were to make all of the inquiries and revisions that we'd like to. You need a deadline. Everybody in publishing needs a deadline. Sir John Chilcot needs a deadline. And we need it because there's some very important questions that, to me, not the bigger ones that Peter mentions, but the more practical ones. And also it's relevant because of Libya, for example. Right now, Libya has become one of perhaps the number one terrorist-generating ungoverned space in the world. Right now, Libya was the place that the Tunisia hotel attacks were planned from. Now, at the time, we thought we still had the capability of intervening, of deposing Gaddafi, and of turning it into a better country. We need to know why that went wrong in Iraq and why it went wrong in Libya. I don't believe, as Peter does, that it can never go right, but it's doomed, because I think that there have been plenty of times, Sierra Leone is just one of them, and perhaps the Bosnian campaign is another, where we intervened and the world is better for us having intervened. I don't take as much of a defeatist attitude. You need to know where to draw the line, and that's where I think Chilcot can help answer that question.
And very finally, Peter, and one thing that's been quite curious about this is that the Labour leadership contenders are using Chilchot as a weapon to avoid a question on bombing Syria. You know, I think Yvette Cooper said we shouldn't do anything until Chilchot is published and what have you. So even though I'm sure you disagree with them, that's not a very sensible position. It must be some irony then, the fact that you wouldn't want to see the UK get involved in such things, but Chilchot is being used as a weapon to stop that from happening.
I just still think a great memorial to the whole farce and disaster would be for the historians to write, and at the end of it they couldn't even compile a report that everyone could agree on what had happened and what had gone wrong. That seems to me to be the tombstone that should be erected over the whole disaster. Any fool can kill a man. None of us can make a human being. Any fool can overthrow a regime. Hardly anyone can replace it with something else. These simple lessons need to be learned, and if we, as a nation, recognise we couldn't even agree on how we'd messed it up, I think we might learn more from it than from several thousand pages of excuse-making verbiage, at the end of which the great Elizabeth Wilmshurst still won't have her GCMG, which she ought to have for having opposed it.
And that's it for this week's episode. Thank you very much to all our guests for joining, and thank you for listening.
The View from 22 was presented and produced by Sebastian Payne.